This is True Crime Stories for Sleep. In the quiet suburbs of Chicago during the early 1940s, the Kaczynski family seemed perfectly ordinary. Ted's father, Theodore Sr., worked long hours at a sausage factory. His mother, Wanda, was devoted and meticulous, the kind of woman who kept every receipt, every school report, every sign that her children might be destined for something greater. Their firstborn son, Theodore John Kaczynski, arrived on May 22, 1942, a small, fragile child with curious eyes who rarely cried. Neighbors remembered the boy as unusually quiet, almost unnerving in his calmness. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this deep dive into one of the most complex criminal minds in American history, make sure to subscribe, like, and comment where you're listening from. This helps us bring you more real stories told in documentary detail. Stories of how intelligence, obsession, and isolation can twist into something unimaginable. Now, let's go back to where Ted's story really begins. From the start, Ted's life unfolded under the weight of expectations. He was a brilliant child, analytical, withdrawn, and eerily focused. At just 9 months old, he suffered a severe allergic reaction that required weeks of isolation in a hospital ward. Wanda later recalled that when he returned home, something had changed. The smiling infant had gone silent. He avoided eye contact. He clung to routines. Some psychologists would later wonder if that early separation had fractured something in him, a line between connection and control that would never fully heal. At school, Ted was the kind of student teachers quietly admired and classmates ignored. He didn't join games or clubs. He sat alone during lunch, reading science books far beyond his age. Mathematics came to him as naturally as breathing. By the time he reached 5th grade, he was solving equations several years ahead of his peers. His teachers began recommending advanced coursework, and the local papers occasionally featured his academic awards. But beneath the surface, there was tension. His intelligence isolated him. Children mocked his formality, his strange diction, his refusal to laugh at jokes. The bullying was subtle at first, whispers, pranks, laughter in hallways, but it deepened as he grew older. Ted retreated further into himself. He began to see the world not as a social landscape but as a set of systems, patterns that could be understood, controlled, perhaps even perfected. By the time he entered high school, he was already different from everyone else. He wore the same clothes every day, spoke with precision, and rarely looked anyone in the eye. But on paper, he was extraordinary. At 15, he graduated early, having skipped 2 grades. His IQ was measured at 167, higher than Einstein's. Teachers expected he'd attend one of the nation's top universities, perhaps even redefine mathematics. But no one noticed that his genius came at a cost, the slow erasure of empathy. At home, his parents tried to protect him from the loneliness that seemed to shadow him. Wanda encouraged Ted to make friends, to join clubs, to experience normal teenage life. His father, a man of science and logic, was proud but distant. The house was filled with books, not conversation. Ted's younger brother, David, looked up to him but rarely saw warmth in return. The Kaczynski household was orderly, intellectual, and emotionally restrained, the perfect environment for a mind that valued logic above feeling. Ted began experimenting with his own form of discipline. He tracked his study hours, restricted his sleep, and limited distractions. Every action became part of a formula: cause and effect, reward and punishment. His notebooks from that time, later found in his cabin decades later, showed early traces of the obsessive patterns that would define him: lists, goals, calculations about time and productivity. It was as though he was training himself not to feel, but to think. In 1958, at 16, Ted Kaczynski was accepted into Harvard University. It was the culmination of every expectation his family had placed upon him. But to Ted, Harvard wasn't a dream, it was a test. He arrived in Cambridge that fall, a boy among men, stepping into one of the most elite institutions in the world. His dorm room was small, his schedule demanding, and his isolation immediate. The other freshmen partied, drank, and explored new freedoms. Ted studied. His classmates found him odd, brilliant but detached. He avoided eye contact, spoke in clipped sentences, and seemed to observe rather than participate. Some found him intimidating, others simply ignored him. Harvard, a place designed for the brightest minds, only amplified his alienation, and yet it was there that fate, or perhaps chance, introduced him to something that would alter his course forever. During his second year, Ted was recruited for a psychological experiment. A professor named Henry Murray was conducting studies on personality and stress. The experiment involved intense, prolonged interviews, during which students were asked to share their deepest beliefs, only to have those beliefs attacked, mocked, and dismantled under controlled conditions. It was meant to measure resilience, but to Ted, it felt like betrayal. For 3 years, he was a participant. Each session, he was told to write about his values and identity, only for researchers to verbally assault his reasoning, degrade his intellect, and ridicule his responses. The sessions were recorded, his humiliation preserved on film. Later reports would reveal that the experiment was funded in part by military agencies studying psychological endurance. To Ted, it was a form of psychological warfare. He left the experiment colder, harder, more withdrawn. His trust in authority, in science, in institutions, in people, fractured beyond repair. Those who knew him later said something in him changed around that time. He still excelled academically, earning his degree in mathematics with honors. But emotionally, he seemed hollowed out. When he graduated from Harvard in 1962, he was barely 20 years old. The world saw a prodigy poised for greatness. He had already been offered scholarships to top graduate schools. Professors expected he would become one of the most brilliant mathematicians of his generation. But beneath that polished surface, something had already begun to decay. Ted Kaczynski had entered Harvard as a boy who sought understanding. He left it a man who distrusted everything human, a mind sharpened like a blade, detached from empathy, searching for a system to blame for the chaos he saw in himself and the world. He didn't yet know what form that resentment would take. But deep down, the seeds were already planted: isolation, humiliation, and a growing conviction that the modern world itself was the enemy. Years later, as investigators pieced together the fragments of his life, they would trace the first fractures back to these years: the cold classrooms of Harvard, the psychological experiments, and the lonely brilliance of a young man who learned to think faster than anyone around him, but never learned how to feel. The story of Ted Kaczynski, the man who would one day become the Unabomber, had begun not with violence, but with silence. When Ted Kaczynski first stepped onto the Harvard campus in 1958, he was 16 years old, small, serious, and startlingly out of place. The red brick courtyards and Gothic towers were filled with students older, taller, louder, and more confident than him. While they explored the new freedoms of adulthood, Ted moved like a shadow through the crowds, polite, quiet, and almost invisible. Harvard, to most, was a world of possibility. To Ted, it was an experiment in survival. He was living in a dormitory reserved for scholarship students, Matthews Hall, one of the oldest buildings on campus. His roommate later described him as intensely private, rarely social, and strangely detached. Ted spent long hours at his desk, filling notebooks with mathematical proofs and philosophical reflections. He ate alone, spoke in a precise, mechanical rhythm, and seemed perpetually deep in thought. He was too young to fit in with the upperclassmen, too intelligent to bond with his peers, and too introverted to try. The isolation that began in childhood only deepened here. Professors praised his work ethic but worried about his lack of engagement. He never raised his hand in lectures. He avoided eye contact. It was as though he existed just outside the edges of human connection, present, but unreachable. During these years, Harvard was also a laboratory of new ideas. Psychology, politics, and social theory collided in every corner of campus. The Cold War loomed large. Fears of communism and nuclear annihilation filled the air. The university's psychology department, flush with government funding, became a playground for experimentation on the human mind. It was in this strange, ambitious climate that Ted's path crossed with that of Professor Henry Murray. Murray was a charismatic figure, a Harvard psychologist who had once worked for the OSS, the wartime precursor to the CIA. He was fascinated by human behavior under stress, by how intellect and emotion broke down under pressure. He wanted to know how far the human mind could be pushed before it fractured. To test his theories, he recruited bright young volunteers from Harvard's student body. Among them was Ted Kaczynski. At first, the project sounded harmless. Students were told they would take part in a study of personal philosophy and leadership under pressure. They were asked to write essays about their beliefs, their moral principles, their sense of purpose. Ted, trusting the authority of science, poured himself into the task. He spent hours crafting a detailed defense of his worldview, his faith in logic, his disdain for conformity, his belief that technology and bureaucracy were corrupting the human soul. When he arrived for his first session, he expected debate. Instead, he found interrogation. The experiment was designed not to test his philosophy, but to destroy it. His essays were handed to an anonymous antagonist, a trained lawyer who dissected, mocked, and humiliated him on camera. Every word he said was recorded, every reaction measured. He was told his reasoning was childish, his arguments meaningless. For hours at a time, under bright lights, he was psychologically dismantled. The experiment continued for 3 years. Week after week, Ted returned to the same small room, sat in the same chair, and endured the same ritual of humiliation. He didn't know that Murray's study was funded, in part, by agencies interested in psychological resistance, research born out of wartime interrogation techniques. To them, Ted was a data point. To Ted, it was betrayal. The sessions left him shaken, though he told no one. His journal entries from this period show a shift, the cold logic of mathematics giving way to bitterness, distrust, and contempt for authority. He began writing about human manipulation, about systems that use people as experiments, about the illusion of freedom. These were the first notes of a philosophy that would one day define him. Outside those sessions, life continued in sterile routine. He earned top grades in mathematics and was soon recognized by professors as a prodigy. But his social world was non-existent. Classmates remembered seeing him wandering the campus alone, carrying notebooks, his face unreadable. He avoided conversation, especially with women, whose presence made him visibly uncomfortable. One professor later said Ted seemed to lack any normal emotional vocabulary. During the long Massachusetts winters, he buried himself in work, calculus, topology, logic. Mathematics became his refuge, a language untainted by human emotion. Numbers never lied, never mocked, never broke their own rules. Yet even in this perfection, Ted began to sense the same flaw he saw in the world, the pursuit of progress for its own sake. He watched as his professors discussed mathematics not as an art, but as a tool, a means to build faster machines, stronger weapons, more efficient systems. He didn't say it aloud, but a quiet rebellion began to take root. In 1962, Ted graduated from Harvard at just 20 years old. He was offered a full scholarship to the University of Michigan, one of the best mathematics programs in the country. On the surface, it looked like triumph. He was on track for a brilliant academic career. But behind the precision of his achievements, something had splintered. Harvard had given him knowledge, but it had also stripped him of trust. He left Cambridge without ceremony, boarding a bus westward, his belongings packed into a single suitcase. He never kept in touch with classmates, never attended reunions, never looked back. For most of his life, he would refuse to speak publicly about the Murray experiment. But decades later, when reporters uncovered the records, they found hours of footage, grainy black and white film of a young Ted Kaczynski sitting rigid in a chair, his face blank as strangers tore his identity apart. Some psychologists would later argue that those sessions played a role in his descent, not as a cause, but as a catalyst. They didn't create the rage that lived in him, but they gave it direction. When Ted arrived in Michigan, he carried that silent anger with him. The campus was large, cold, industrial. The university's sprawling laboratories and computer centers were symbols of the technological age that Ted already despised. He excelled in his coursework, earning his master's degree in 1964 and his doctorate in 1967. His dissertation, Boundary Functions, was so advanced that few could even understand it. One professor called it the work of a genius. But outside his research, he began to deteriorate. He lived in near total isolation, renting a bare apartment, rarely socializing, avoiding faculty events. When students tried to befriend him, he turned them away with abrupt, awkward replies. He began keeping a journal, pages filled with contempt for society, for its noise, its conformity, its blind faith in machines. He wrote about the industrial world as if it were a living organism, one that consumed humanity piece by piece. He began to fantasize about escape, about finding a place untouched by the machines, a place where he could think freely. He dreamed of wilderness, silence, and the satisfaction of self-reliance. To his professors, he was still a promising scholar. To himself, he was already in exile. By 1967, Ted had completed his PhD and was offered a teaching position at the University of California, Berkeley, a prestigious post for someone barely 25 years old. But even then, he hesitated. Academia no longer inspired him. It disgusted him. The idea of standing before classrooms, teaching abstract theories to students who would go on to serve the very system he despised, filled him with quiet rage. Still, he accepted. One last attempt to live inside the world before rejecting it completely. What no one realized then was that the seeds of his future manifesto had already been planted in those sterile Harvard laboratories. The man who would one day isolate himself in a Montana cabin had first learned the power, and the peril, of human manipulation under fluorescent lights in Cambridge. Ted Kaczynski left Harvard as one of the most brilliant minds of his generation. But somewhere between those red brick walls and the clinical glare of the psychology lab, he had crossed an invisible line, from genius to fracture, from student to stranger. The world saw only the diploma. He carried home the damage. When Ted Kaczynski arrived in Berkeley in the fall of 1967, he carried himself with the quiet precision of a man who had mastered his world. He was 25 years old, the youngest assistant professor ever hired by the University of California's mathematics department. To the outside eye, he was a rising star, a prodigy with a mind built for abstract thought. His colleagues called him the real thing, brilliant, detached, destined for tenure. But to those who shared a hallway with him, something was off. He spoke little, avoided eye contact, and seemed uncomfortable in conversation. He had a habit of staring through people, as though he were studying an equation that only he could see. He wore the same faded clothes, carried the same notebook everywhere, and walked the campus alone. At first, he approached teaching with the same precision he brought to his research. His lectures were technically flawless, delivered in a quiet monotone that few students could follow. He covered the blackboard in dense symbols, filled every silence with logic, and ended each class exactly on time. There was no small talk, no jokes, no warmth. Some students admired his brilliance, most found him intimidating. A few complained that he seemed angry, as though their confusion offended him. Within a year, the department began to notice cracks. He missed meetings. He failed to return assignments. He stopped answering letters from colleagues. When the department chair tried to discuss his future at Berkeley, Ted listened in silence, nodded once, and left without a word. Then, in the spring of 1969, after just 2 years, he resigned. No notice, no explanation. He packed his few belongings into a box, turned in his keys, and walked away from academia forever. To those who knew him, it made no sense. He had a lifetime of security ahead of him, tenure, research funding, prestige. But to Ted, Berkeley had become unbearable. The campus buzzed with student protests, anti-war demonstrations, and the growing chaos of the 1960s. To him, it was a glimpse of what he already despised: mass movements, political slogans, noise masquerading as freedom. He saw technology spreading into every corner of life: computers, automation, synthetic order. It disgusted him. He wanted silence. That summer, Ted returned to his parents' home in Lombard, Illinois. His brother David still lived there, working at their father's small foam-cutting business. Ted spent his days reading philosophy and working on small mechanical projects in the garage. He spoke little, ate mechanically, and spent hours walking the streets alone. Wanda, his mother, worried. She tried to draw him out, to ask what he planned to do next. He never answered directly. By the following year, his plan began to take shape. He wanted to disappear, not as a figure of mystery, but as an act of rebellion. He dreamed of living beyond the reach of modern society, of building his own shelter, growing his own food, surviving without machines. It was not a vacation from life, but an escape from civilization itself. In 1971, he withdrew his savings and bought a small plot of land near Lincoln, Montana, about 1.5 acres, surrounded by thick pine forests and snow-fed streams. The nearest town was 15 miles away. There were no neighbors, no power lines, no noise but the wind. He built his cabin by hand that summer. It was small, 10 by 12 feet, made of rough timber and scavenged nails. There was no electricity, no plumbing, no running water. He cooked on a wood stove and read by candlelight. Every object had a purpose. His journals from those early years in Montana read like a blueprint for control. He cataloged everything: the temperature each morning, the tracks of animals near his camp, the precise times of sunrise and sunset. He hunted rabbits, grew potatoes, and trapped small game. He read books on philosophy, anthropology, and survival. He wrote about freedom, not as a political ideal, but as a state of being untouched by the system. At first, the solitude suited him. He found rhythm in the stillness, comfort in the predictability of nature. Each day began with a fire and ended with silence. He watched the seasons change and felt, for the first time, free of the machinery he despised. "I can live without them," he wrote. "Without electricity, without cars, without the endless noise. But isolation, like genius, can sharpen and distort the mind." Over time, Ted's journals darkened. He began writing about the technological system, as if it were a living creature, a vast, mechanical organism consuming everything in its path. He saw evidence of its reach everywhere: airplanes crossing the sky, logging trucks cutting through the forest, the faint hum of engines from the town below. Each sound became a reminder of the world he had tried to escape. He started to fantasize about resistance, not in slogans or politics, but in small acts of revenge against the machine. He sabotaged logging equipment, pulled survey stakes from the ground, and destroyed machinery he found near his land. To him, these were not crimes but symbols, gestures of defiance against what he saw as the death of human freedom. His anger grew in proportion to his isolation. The longer he lived alone, the more the outside world became a threat. He viewed every technological advancement as an act of aggression, every new road as a wound in the wilderness. His writing began to take on the tone of a prophet rather than a hermit. He believed humanity was enslaved by its own inventions, that every new convenience was a step deeper into dependence. By the mid-1970s, Ted's visits into town had become rare and tense. Locals knew him as a recluse, a man who avoided conversation and paid in cash. He would appear at the library, check out books on chemistry, philosophy, and electronics, then vanish back into the forest. His clothing was worn and patched. His beard grew long. He looked less like a scholar and more like a man trying to erase himself. At home, his parents worried but could not reach him. Wanda sent letters, sometimes packages of food or supplies. Ted answered sporadically, his tone clipped and formal. He told them he was fine, that he preferred solitude, that they shouldn't worry. But behind those polite replies was growing resentment toward a family that, in his mind, represented everything weak about modern humanity: dependence, conformity, compromise. One day, without warning, he stopped writing altogether. David, his younger brother, visited the cabin in 1975. What he found unsettled him. The structure was small, cold, and bare, books stacked on the floor, tools arranged with obsessive order. Ted was gaunt but alert, his eyes sharp. He spoke calmly, but every sentence carried bitterness. He told David that society was doomed, that technology was destroying the planet, that people were losing the ability to live without machines. "You'll see," he said. "You'll all see." After that visit, David drove away uneasy, not knowing that it would be years before he saw his brother again. As the decade turned, Ted's isolation hardened into ideology. He was no longer just living apart from society. He was studying it from a distance, dissecting it like a diseased organism. He saw patterns in everything, in economics, in psychology, in the rhythm of traffic on distant highways. He believed he had uncovered the truth, that technology was not serving humanity but replacing it. In his notebooks, the language of mathematics began to merge with the language of rebellion. Sentences turned to manifestos, reflections to declarations. He began to describe the coming collapse of civilization, not as a tragedy, but as a liberation. In the years to come, the world would learn his name through fear, through chaos, through the sound of sirens. But here, in the cold silence of Montana, that story was still forming, the story of a man who walked away from the world, only to return as its enemy. The cabin stood quiet, surrounded by snow and pine. Inside, a fire burned, and a man wrote by candlelight, the first drafts of an idea that would one day shake the nation. In the stillness of the Montana wilderness, years passed with little to mark their passing. Ted Kaczynski lived like a shadow among the trees, hunting, trapping, planting, repairing, reading, and writing. To an outsider, it might have seemed peaceful, almost monastic. But beneath that quiet rhythm, something was beginning to turn. His notebooks, filled with sketches of wildflowers, temperature logs, and philosophical notes, began to change tone. The patient observations of nature gave way to anger, directed not at any person in particular, but at civilization itself. He began to write about the industrial system, as though it were a beast. A living organism spreading over the earth, consuming land, enslaving minds, stripping people of purpose. He described humans as domesticated animals, numbed by comfort and incapable of independence. To him, every truck that rumbled down a logging road, every plane that cut across the sky, was a reminder of what humanity had lost, a world of silence, simplicity, autonomy. And yet, his philosophy alone no longer satisfied him. Words, he felt, were powerless. He had lived years in protest, refusing electricity, surviving with almost nothing, and still the world roared on, louder and brighter each day. The air above his valley buzzed with the noise of aircraft, cutting through what had once been sacred silence. When logging companies moved in near his land, felling acres of pine and tearing up the ground with machinery, something in him snapped. He would later write about that moment, not as an impulse, but as a revelation. "I decided that I would kill," he confessed in his private journals years later. "I would strike back." It began small. He sabotaged traps, destroyed equipment, and scattered nails along the tires of machines left near his property. But the satisfaction was brief. He realized that simple vandalism changed nothing. The system would replace what he broke, rebuild what he destroyed. He needed a message, something that could not be ignored, something that would make society feel what he felt. By 1978, Ted Kaczynski had begun to emerge from the wilderness, quietly, methodically, into the world he had renounced. He hitchhiked to cities under the anonymity of scruffy clothes and dark glasses, blending in with the transient and forgotten. He watched people, studied them, the way they moved through airports, the way they stared into screens and machines with trust and dependence. It repulsed him. And it confirmed his conviction. They had surrendered their humanity. He began to imagine ways to make them stop and look, to make them feel the cost of the world they had built. That spring, at Northwestern University in Illinois, a strange package appeared in the campus mailroom. It was crudely wrapped, bearing the return address of a university professor. When a campus officer tried to return it, the object burst open, injuring his hands. The incident drew little attention, just a small blurb in the local paper. But in Ted's mind, it had worked. He had struck a blow, and the world had flinched. He returned to Montana, writing in his journal with renewed focus. "Experiment successful," he noted, the words as cold and clinical as any scientific report. He refined his methods, adjusting designs, testing materials, sketching schematics in the margins of his notebooks. To him, this was not madness but logic, a mathematical response to an emotional world. A year later, another incident followed. Then another. Airports, universities, offices, each time a new target, each time slightly more elaborate, slightly more visible. The press began to notice, though no one had any idea who was responsible. The pattern seemed random, the motives unclear. There was no message, no claim of responsibility. Just confusion and fear. The FBI formed a task force, the beginnings of what would later be known as the Unabomber case, shorthand for university and airline bomber. They saw a pattern emerging but had no suspect, no profile. The man they were hunting left no fingerprints, no traceable materials, no witnesses. He moved through the world like a ghost, constructing his devices in the shadows, mailing them from distant towns, and then vanishing back into the woods. In Montana, Ted followed the coverage closely. Each headline confirmed his growing sense of power, not power over individuals, but over the system itself. He had found a way to make the machine hesitate. Back home, his days remained unchanged on the surface. He rose before dawn, chopped wood, tended his garden, wrote long letters that he never mailed. But his thoughts had crossed the threshold. What had once been private frustration was now a campaign. He began to articulate it to himself as war, not between nations, but between man and the system. His journals from this period revealed the gradual merging of intellect and obsession. He would record a philosophical reflection on one page. Technology destroys freedom by making survival dependent on the system. And then, on the next, a set of technical calculations, written in the same precise hand. The two halves of his mind, the mathematician and the revolutionary, had finally fused. By 1980, the FBI's investigation had spread across several states. Agents interviewed hundreds of suspects, disgruntled professors, chemistry students, mechanics, former employees of airlines. But Ted Kaczynski's name never appeared in any report. He was invisible, a man who had no phone, no bank account, no electricity, no social ties. His cabin was not even listed on official maps. Meanwhile, in Lincoln, locals began to notice oddities about their reclusive neighbor. He would come into town rarely, his clothes worn, his face thin and pale. He bought supplies: salt, flour, matches, batteries, paying only in cash. He was polite but distant, answering questions with a faint, almost academic tone. He seemed intelligent, perhaps eccentric, but harmless. Nobody could have imagined that the quiet man walking down the dirt road with a worn backpack was the most wanted domestic terrorist in America. When he returned from those rare trips into town, the forest seemed to swallow him. The cabin, nearly invisible beneath the pines, became both his sanctuary and his workshop. There, among books and metal scraps, he spent long nights writing, sketching, constructing. He described his mission not in terms of hatred but necessity. "The human race has lost control of its destiny," he wrote. "To destroy the system is to save mankind." Yet even as he convinced himself of righteousness, there were moments of flickering doubt. His journal entries from late 1980 reveal a man torn between his ideals and his humanity. He wrote about missing companionship, about dreams of childhood, about his mother's letters. But those moments of softness always ended the same way, with renewed disgust for the weakness he saw in emotion. To him, empathy was part of the trap. As winter closed in on Montana, Ted sat alone in his cabin, staring into the fire. The flames reflected in his glasses, small and contained, like the thoughts burning inside him. He believed the world was enslaved, that people were blind to their bondage, and that he, a solitary man in the wilderness, had been chosen by reason itself to remind them. In the coming years, his actions would escalate. His philosophy would evolve into a manifesto, his voice rising from obscurity into infamy. But here, at the dawn of the 1980s, Ted Kaczynski was still a ghost on the edge of the wilderness, a man who had vanished from society only to return as its unseen adversary. The trees stood silent around him, their branches heavy with snow. From the distance, the faint hum of a jet drifted through the air, the sound of everything he despised, moving across the sky toward a world that would soon, unknowingly, bear his mark. By the early 1980s, The mystery bomber had become an uneasy whisper among university faculty and airline staff. The incidents were still rare, spaced out by years, but they left scars that didn't fade. Each explosion came without pattern, without warning, and without reason. Then the silence would return, heavy and uncertain, as investigators searched for traces that never appeared. Ted Kaczynski watched all of it from his cabin in Montana. He read the reports, clipping small news pieces from papers he bought during rare trips into town. Each article was stored carefully in an old envelope, marked only with dates and cryptic notes. He kept track of his work not through emotion but through record, evidence of a campaign only he could understand. Inside the cabin, his life followed the same rhythm it always had: rise before dawn, chop wood, prepare a fire, write. But there was a new tension now, a sense of purpose guiding his isolation. He no longer felt like an exile. He was, in his mind, a soldier, one waging a war invisible to the very civilization he sought to destroy. That summer, he began constructing again. His tools were crude, bits of wire, scrap metal, wooden boxes, yet his hands moved with precision. Each component was measured, each mechanism tested again and again until it met his standards. His background in mathematics lent him an advantage. His mind could hold equations, patterns, and mechanical functions in perfect order. He approached his work the way a scientist approaches an experiment, detached but determined. In 1982, another bomb surfaced. This one, sent to an academic, followed the same pattern: handmade, carefully disguised, devastating in its simplicity. It injured but did not kill. The details were enough for the FBI to confirm what they had begun to suspect. This was no series of coincidences. There was one man behind it all. They began calling him Unabomber, short for University and Airline Bomber. The code name stuck, and soon, the public adopted a darker one: the Unabomber. Kaczynski, of course, never used that name. To him, the media's language was part of the illusion he hated. They reduced everything to spectacle, to sound bites and nicknames. In his eyes, the real message was not in the violence itself but in the warning behind it: that society was out of control, that technology was consuming freedom, that humanity was losing itself. But Ted's warnings were written in fire and metal. Each explosion was both a statement and an experiment. He adjusted materials, timing, and complexity, learning from each attempt. His bombs began to show a kind of evolution. Investigators noticed subtle improvements, small changes that revealed growing expertise. Yet even as his methods grew sophisticated, his life remained primitive. He built tools by hand, cooked over open flames, and mended his clothes with thread pulled from old socks. Years went by this way, bursts of violence followed by long stretches of silence. The FBI, despite hundreds of leads, had nothing. Agents came and went, new task forces were formed. Composite sketches filled bulletin boards, string lines connected maps, and theories multiplied. Some thought the bomber was a team, perhaps even a rogue scientist or a political extremist group. Nobody considered the possibility that he was a single man living alone in a wooden shack deep in the wilderness, surviving on oatmeal, bread, and wild game. In Montana, the winters grew harsher. Kaczynski's beard thickened, his body grew lean. He spoke to no one for weeks at a time. Yet his mind never rested. He continued to write in small, neat script, notes on philosophy, fragments of essays, and reflections on the decay of human independence. In the evenings, he walked along the frozen riverbank, his breath visible in the pale air, thinking of the world beyond the trees, a world he believed he had already left behind. Sometimes he imagined what the investigators must be doing. He pictured them gathered around tables under fluorescent lights, studying fragments of wood and wire, trying to read his thoughts from the residue of smoke and debris. He took pride in staying invisible. "They will never find me," he wrote once. "Their system blinds them." Still, paranoia began to creep in. The isolation that had once felt pure started to turn claustrophobic. He worried about hunters stumbling across his cabin, about helicopters passing overhead, about leaving even the faintest footprint in the snow. Every sound in the forest seemed sharper, the crack of ice, the creak of trees, the distant bark of a dog. He began to move more cautiously, hiding tools under piles of brush, burying unused materials beneath the frozen soil. In the summer of 1985, the Unabomber struck again, 3 times in a single year. One device killed an airline executive in California. Another severely injured a graduate student. The FBI's anxiety deepened. They had profilers, analysts, and forensic experts, but nothing connected. The bomber's targets seemed to follow a theme: universities, airlines, symbols of progress. But the motive was impossible to pin down. For the first time, the case drew national attention. Television anchors spoke the name, Unabomber, with solemn fear. Airports increased security. Postal workers grew cautious of every strange package. And somewhere in Montana, the man behind it all sat at his handmade desk, listening to a small battery-powered radio, hearing his alias echo across the nation. He had become a myth, a phantom who struck without warning and disappeared without trace. To Ted, that anonymity was the truest victory. His entire life had been an act of separation, from family, from friends, from civilization itself. Now, that separation had become his greatest weapon. But with the growing fame came new dangers. Each attack tightened the net around him. The FBI began building psychological profiles: a man of intelligence, likely with technical training, possibly living in isolation. They speculated he might be a former academic, embittered by failure. The profile was closer than anyone realized. Still, Ted Kaczynski was patient. He had no deadlines, no partners to betray him. He waited, plotted, and struck only when he chose. Through it all, his journals reveal an eerie calm. "It is not rage," he wrote during one of the lulls. "It is necessity." He saw his campaign as a kind of purification, a cleansing of the world's corruption. To him, technology was not progress, it was decay. Every new invention chained humanity further to a system it no longer controlled. When the snow fell again that winter, Ted sat by the fire, reading by candlelight. He still repaired his own tools, carved small handles for knives, and collected herbs for tea. But there was something heavier in the air, a sense that his mission, once secret and sacred, had grown too large to contain. The FBI was closing in, even if they didn't yet know it. Outside, the forest lay silent under a blanket of white. The stars above Montana burned sharp and clear, indifferent to the turmoil below. Ted stared at them for a long time before turning back inside. The light from his cabin flickered briefly, then went dark, a tiny point of isolation in the endless black of the mountains, hiding a man who believed he was reshaping the fate of humanity. He slept soundly that night. Tomorrow would be another quiet day in the woods, another morning of firewood, of writing, of planning. The world, for now, still had no idea where to look. By the mid-1980s, Ted Kaczynski's war had entered a strange rhythm. Years of silence would pass, and then suddenly, an explosion, a headline, another mystery for investigators to chase. To the world, he was a phantom. To himself, he was simply following logic. The modern world, he believed, was beyond saving. Only fear could slow it down. But even he knew that explosions alone couldn't tell the whole story. He wanted his words to outlive the noise. Inside his cabin, a small oil lamp burned as Ted wrote late into the night. His handwriting was precise, deliberate, shaped by years of academic training. Paragraph after paragraph filled the pages, thoughts about industrial society, freedom, the psychological effects of modern life. It was not a diary anymore. It was a manifesto. A declaration of war, but also, in his mind, a diagnosis of the human condition. He titled it Industrial Society, and its future. In it, he argued that technology had enslaved mankind. That progress was an illusion, a trap. He described the system as self-replicating, feeding off human desire for comfort and safety. He wrote that every new innovation, every advance, stripped people of autonomy. To him, the solution was not reform but destruction, the dismantling of the technological system itself. He spent years refining the text, revising and rearranging paragraphs with the precision of a mathematician. In between his attacks, he rewrote sentences, adjusted tone, and tested ideas against the world's reaction. When a bombing drew media attention, he noted which parts of his philosophy the press seemed to grasp, and which they didn't. He believed his final document would correct those misunderstandings. The Unabomber case, meanwhile, was becoming a national obsession. The FBI's task force, now called Unabomber, had grown into one of the largest in the Bureau's history. Hundreds of agents sifted through fragments of wood, metal, and wiring. They created massive databases, tracking every similar device, every handcrafted part. But their suspect remained invisible. By 1987, investigators had one breakthrough, a single eyewitness account. A woman at a computer store in Utah described a man who had left a suspicious package just before an explosion. She remembered his glasses, his hooded sweatshirt, and the mustache that half concealed his face. Forensic artists produced a sketch, narrow features, intelligent eyes, a hard expression. It was the first image the public would ever see of the Unabomber. When the drawing appeared on television, Ted saw it too. He was in a small cafe in Helena, sipping coffee after a trip to the post office. On the black and white screen above the counter, he saw his own likeness staring back. He froze for a moment, then lowered his head and finished his drink. No one in the cafe seemed to notice. He walked out quietly, heart steady. The image was close, but not perfect. Enough to unnerve him, but not enough to expose him. Still, he knew he had to disappear again. He returned to his cabin and buried materials deep in the ground, scattering papers and parts into sealed containers, hidden beneath rocks and brush. Then he waited, for weeks, for months, listening for the sound of engines or boots approaching his door. None came, but the near miss changed him. His writings grew darker, more urgent. "We are nearing the end," he wrote. "The machine will soon close around us. Now is the time to strike at the system's heart." He began planning something new, not just another bomb, but an idea. He wanted to communicate with the public directly, to bypass the system he despised. He wrote letters to newspapers, to universities, even to victims. The tone was cold but articulate. He presented himself not as a man, but as a thinker, a man with a purpose. In 1993, after several years of silence, the bombs began again. A geneticist, a computer scientist, an advertising executive, each received packages bearing his unmistakable craftsmanship. The injuries were severe. The message was still obscure. The FBI could trace patterns, but not identity. And through it all, Ted's manifesto grew longer, clearer, more complete. By the mid-1990s, he had come to a decision. The world would hear his words in full. He would publish them, not under his name, but under the title, Industrial Society and Its Future. And he would make the world choose, print his message, or more people would die. The ultimatum arrived at major newspapers and television networks in 1995. A letter, carefully worded, explained his demands. If the New York Times or the Washington Post published his essay in its entirety, he would end his campaign. If they refused, the bombings would continue. The FBI debated the offer for weeks. Publishing the words of a terrorist felt like surrender. But withholding them risked more violence. Intelligence analysts read the essay and concluded that it might hold clues, turns of phrase, linguistic habits, patterns that could help identify the author. The Attorney General and the FBI Director agreed it would be safer to publish. And so, on September 19, 1995, the Washington Post printed Industrial Society and Its Future in full, across 8 pages of newsprint. Millions of Americans unfolded their morning papers to find the words of the man they had feared for nearly 2 decades. Ted Kaczynski read the essay too, sitting alone in his cabin, the printed pages spread across his desk. For the first time, his voice had reached beyond the trees. He imagined office workers, professors, truck drivers, students, all reading his words, grappling with ideas he had spent his life forming. For a moment, he felt vindicated. He had outsmarted the system, used its own media to deliver his warning. But the same words that gave him pride also betrayed him. Somewhere hundreds of miles away, in upstate New York, a man named David Kaczynski read the same essay. The writing style, the phrasing, the rhythm, they were hauntingly familiar. David showed it to his wife, Linda. "Doesn't this sound like Ted?" she asked. He didn't want to believe it. His older brother, the brilliant, withdrawn boy he had once idolized, couldn't be the Unabomber. But the more he read, the more impossible it became to deny. The unusual word choices, the sentence structure, even the way Ted described the system, it was all the same. David hesitated for weeks, torn between loyalty and duty. But he knew what had to be done. Quietly, he contacted a lawyer, who then approached the FBI. Soon, agents received a document comparing Ted's old letters with the manifesto. The similarities were undeniable. The Phantom finally had a name. In Montana, Ted remained unaware that the walls were closing in. He continued writing, unaware that his own words, the very thing he believed would immortalize him, had given him away. The FBI's path to the cabin had begun, not through fingerprints or forensic evidence, but through the mind of a brother who recognized a voice the world had feared for years. And as winter crept over the mountains again, the ghost of the Unabomber sat at his wooden desk, believing he had conquered the system. Unaware that the system, through his own words, was already finding its way back to him. Snow blanketed the Montana mountains in silence that winter. Inside his cabin, Ted Kaczynski sat by the dim glow of a kerosene lamp, scribbling in his notebook. The words flowed with an intensity that bordered on feverish. He believed the world had finally heard him. His manifesto had been published, his philosophy now immortalized in print. He had delivered his message to millions, and for the first time in years, he felt something close to satisfaction. Far away, in Schenectady, New York, David Kaczynski sat at his kitchen table, staring at the same words. The newspaper was folded open to the essay that had captivated and terrified the nation, industrial society, and its future. As he read, the words began to echo in his mind with an uncomfortable familiarity. The turns of phrase, the rhythm, the obsession with freedom and control. It was Ted's voice. He had not spoken to his brother in years, but the cadence of the sentences was unmistakable. Ted's writing had always carried that same measured intensity, logical, sharp, and slightly detached. The essay didn't just sound like him, it was him. David's stomach turned. The possibility felt impossible, yet undeniable. He read on, hoping to find a passage that proved him wrong. But each paragraph only deepened his dread. When his wife, Linda, came home, he showed her the paper. "Does this remind you of anyone?" he asked, trying to sound casual. She read in silence for a few minutes before looking up, eyes wide. "This sounds just like Ted," she said. David didn't sleep that night. Memories of his older brother flooded back. The long walks they took as children, Ted's brilliance, his intensity, his growing disdain for society. He remembered how Ted had withdrawn after leaving Harvard, moving from one job to another before retreating into isolation. Over the years, the letters Ted sent had become more erratic, filled with talk of technology, control, and the destruction of freedom. The similarities were too precise to ignore. But to believe that Ted, his quiet, reclusive brother, was the Unabomber meant accepting that the man he loved had killed and maimed people for decades. Days passed before David gathered the courage to act. He searched through old letters and essays Ted had sent him years earlier, comparing them to the manifesto. The phrasing was almost identical. He shared his concerns with Linda, who insisted they had to go to the authorities. David hesitated. He didn't want Ted hunted down or killed. He just wanted to know the truth. Eventually, David contacted a lawyer named Tony Bichelier, who specialized in federal cases. He explained the situation, his suspicions, his fear, and his moral dilemma. Bichelier listened carefully and agreed to help. He promised to keep David's name confidential while reaching out to the FBI to discuss the potential connection. In Washington, the Unabomber task force was drowning in leads, thousands of suspects, mountains of evidence, and no solid identification. When Bichelier contacted them, suggesting that a man in Montana might match the Unabomber's profile, the agents were skeptical. But when the lawyer sent copies of Ted's old writings for comparison, the skepticism faded. The FBI's forensic linguists began their work. They analyzed the word patterns, sentence structure, and vocabulary of the letters versus the manifesto. Both contained the same unusual phrases. Cool-headed logician, the system's psychological suffering, technological slavery. Even Ted's punctuation, his preference for hyphens and his deliberate use of italics, matched perfectly. The evidence was compelling, but not conclusive. The Bureau needed more, something tangible that tied Ted Kaczynski to the bombs. Still, the linguistic analysis was enough to justify a deeper look. They began to quietly investigate the man behind the name. Agents traced Ted's life from Harvard to Berkeley, then to Montana. They uncovered his history of isolation, his disdain for technology, his intelligence, his ability with tools and machinery. They learned about his male habits, his survivalist tendencies, and his long-standing resentment toward modern civilization. Everything pointed to him. By late 1995, the task force had a new focus: Theodore J. Kaczynski, resident of Lincoln, Montana. But even then, David struggled with what he had done. He hadn't told his brother. He hadn't warned him. He carried a heavy sense of betrayal, though he knew it was the only moral choice. He wrote in his journal about the conflict tearing him apart: loyalty versus responsibility, blood versus conscience. Meanwhile, in Montana, Ted remained oblivious. His life continued in its rigid routine: cutting firewood, checking traps, boiling water, and writing. The cabin's small radio was his only link to the outside world, and even that he used sparingly. He occasionally tuned into news reports, listening with quiet satisfaction as journalists discussed his manifesto and the growing public fascination with the Unabomber. The FBI, however, was closing in. Agents began covert surveillance around Lincoln. They tracked his movements, analyzed his mail, and spoke discreetly with locals. Ted was known in the area as a loner, polite but distant, living without electricity or running water. His neighbors barely saw him, except when he rode his bike into town to collect mail or buy supplies. In February 1996, the FBI secured a search warrant for the cabin. They suspected that inside they might find the materials used in the bombs, or even the bombs themselves. But they knew they had to approach carefully. The man they were dealing with was intelligent, dangerous, and possibly armed. On the morning of April 3, 1996, the silence around the cabin was broken by the sound of vehicles pulling up the narrow dirt road. Agents moved in, surrounding the property. They wore plain clothes, posing as Forest Service officers to avoid alarming him. When they knocked on the door, Ted opened it slightly. He looked calm but wary. The agents asked if he'd step outside to answer a few questions about land use. Ted hesitated, glancing toward the woods behind them. Then he stepped outside. Within moments, agents seized him. Ted didn't resist. He looked from face to face, his expression unreadable, as they placed handcuffs around his wrists. The long chase was over. The ghost of the Unabomber had a face, and it was the quiet mathematician from Montana. Inside the cabin, agents found exactly what they had feared and expected. Shelves stacked with chemicals, boxes of nails, wires, circuits, handwritten notes detailing bomb designs. And buried beneath his papers, a live, fully assembled bomb ready to be mailed. There were also hundreds of pages of journals, coded notes, and drafts of his manifesto. Each page was meticulous, filled with thoughts about humanity's decline and the purity of nature. It was as though the cabin had become a physical extension of his mind, part laboratory, part sanctuary, part tomb. When news of his arrest broke, America erupted. The Unabomber, who had terrorized the country for nearly 2 decades, had been living in a 10 by 12-foot shack with no electricity, just miles from small-town families who never suspected a thing. In New York, David watched the coverage with a mix of relief and heartbreak. His worst fears were confirmed, but so was his hope that no one else would die. He had helped end the violence, but at a terrible cost. The brother he loved was now the nation's most infamous criminal. Ted, meanwhile, sat in a holding cell, silent and expressionless. When agents asked if he wanted a lawyer, he gave a faint smile and said nothing. The cabin that had shielded him for 25 years was gone. The wilderness that had protected him could no longer keep the world out. He had built his own prison long before the bars appeared. The cell was quiet, save for the rhythmic hum of fluorescent lights above. Ted Kaczynski sat at a small metal desk, a stack of legal documents before him. His glasses were slightly crooked, his beard untrimmed. In the weeks following his arrest, the cabin had been dismantled, boxed, and shipped to an FBI facility for evidence processing. The man who had once lived alone in the forest, writing his philosophy by lamplight, now found himself under the cold glare of fluorescent prison lighting. Outside the cell, the world buzzed with a strange fascination. The Unabomber had a name, a face, and a story that defied expectation. How could a Harvard-educated mathematician turn into a domestic terrorist living in a one-room shack? The question dominated headlines and late-night news broadcasts. Journalists descended on Lincoln, Montana, interviewing anyone who had ever crossed paths with the quiet recluse. Neighbors who once waved politely were now at the center of an international story. Inside the Justice Department, however, the tone was far from curious. It was urgent. The case against Ted Kaczynski had to be airtight. Over 17 years, the Unabomber's attacks had left 3 people dead and 23 injured. The FBI had gathered thousands of pieces of evidence, fragments of devices, letters, typewriter ribbons, notes written in code. Now, every piece would be used to build the case that this man, this isolated hermit, was responsible. Ted was placed under the custody of the U.S. Marshals and transferred to a federal detention center in Sacramento, California. He was quiet during transport, eyes fixed on the window as miles of desert and farmland passed beneath the plane. He never once asked where they were taking him. Once in custody, he was assigned a team of defense attorneys, Judy Clark and Quinn Denvere, both experienced in high-profile federal cases. Clark had defended some of the country's most notorious criminals, and she quickly understood that her new client was unlike anyone she had represented before. During their first meeting, Ted sat across from her, hands folded, his posture rigid. Clark began with a simple question. "Do you understand the charges against you?" Ted nodded slowly. "I understand," he said softly. She pressed on, trying to gauge his state of mind. "You're facing the death penalty, Mr. Kaczynski. The government will seek it." Ted looked at her evenly. "It doesn't matter," he said. "They can kill me, but they can't kill the truth." That was the essence of Ted Kaczynski, calm, detached, but unwavering in his conviction. He saw himself not as a murderer, but as a messenger. Over the following weeks, his lawyers tried to build a defense based on mental illness. Psychiatrists were brought in to evaluate him. The reports were extensive, filled with references to paranoia, social detachment, and possible schizophrenia. But Ted rejected every attempt to portray him as insane. He refused medication, denied the diagnosis, and grew increasingly hostile toward his legal team. He believed that to plead insanity would be to discredit his message. He didn't want to be remembered as a madman. He wanted to be seen as a revolutionary philosopher, a man who had acted out of logic, not delusion. In letters written from his cell, he expressed his frustration. "They are trying to paint me as mentally defective because that is easier than admitting that my ideas might make sense." The prosecutors, meanwhile, prepared a formidable case. They had the cabin's contents cataloged, bomb components, chemicals, wiring, and handwritten journals describing each attack in meticulous detail. They had linguistic evidence linking the manifesto to Ted's personal letters. They even had fingerprints and DNA samples connecting him to several packages. Every detail fit. The profile the FBI had built over years of investigation matched perfectly. The evidence was overwhelming, yet Ted remained calm. When his lawyers visited, he spoke little about the trial. Instead, he discussed books, philosophy, and the degradation of human freedom. He wrote constantly, filling notebooks with reflections on his confinement and on the civilization he believed was destroying itself. As the trial date approached in late 1997, tension grew within the defense team. Judy Clark and her colleagues believed their only hope of sparing Ted's life was to argue diminished capacity, to show that he was not fully in control of his actions. But Ted refused to cooperate. When he realized that his lawyers intended to portray him as mentally ill, he exploded in anger for the first time. "They're lying about me," he shouted during a meeting. "They're trying to destroy everything I stood for." In his frustration, Ted drafted a handwritten motion asking the court to dismiss his lawyers and allow him to represent himself. He believed they were conspiring with the prosecution to silence his ideas. The motion was denied. Clark argued that he was incapable of mounting his own defense, a statement that only infuriated him more. By January 1998, the conflict had reached its peak. Ted was found in his cell with a noose made from his underwear and a piece of wire. The attempt was interrupted by guards before he could act, but it was clear he was unraveling. The same man who had lived for decades in total control of his world now faced a reality he could not manipulate. The incident changed everything. After that night, Ted became more subdued. He stopped arguing with his lawyers and agreed to listen to their advice. Clark saw the shift and moved quickly. She knew the prosecution had enough evidence to guarantee a conviction, and likely, an execution. The only way to save Ted's life was to negotiate. Behind closed doors, Clark met with federal prosecutors to propose a deal. Ted would plead guilty to all charges if the government agreed not to seek the death penalty. After days of deliberation, the Justice Department accepted. On January 22, 1998, Ted Kaczynski walked into the courtroom in Sacramento for his plea hearing. The room was packed. Journalists, victims' families, federal agents, and curious onlookers filled every seat. He wore a simple beige prison uniform, his hands shackled. His expression was calm, almost serene. The judge read the charges aloud: 10 counts of transporting explosives with intent to kill or injure, 10 counts of mailing bombs, and 3 counts of murder. Ted listened without reaction. When asked how he pleaded, he spoke clearly. "Guilty, Your Honor." A hush fell over the courtroom. It was the end of one of the longest manhunts in U.S. history, and the quiet collapse of a man who had declared war on modern society. He was sentenced to 8 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The judge's final words echoed through the room. "You will spend the rest of your life in prison. You will die there." Ted nodded once. There was no visible emotion, no protest, no visible relief. Only stillness. As the guards led him away, reporters rushed to file their stories. Headlines that evening carried the same message. "The Unabomber pleads guilty." For the public, the story had ended. But for Ted, it was simply another chapter in his solitary existence. Only now, the walls were made of concrete instead of pine. In the months that followed, he was transferred to the Supermax prison in Florence, Colorado, the most secure facility in the United States. There, he was placed in a small cell measuring roughly the size of his old cabin. No forest, no wilderness, no silence, just the hum of security systems and the sound of metal doors closing. And yet, in that confinement, Ted Kaczynski did what he had always done. He wrote pages of reflections, letters to academics, correspondence with supporters and critics alike. His words continued to travel far beyond the walls that contained him, the ghost of his ideology lingering long after the man himself had vanished from sight. The concrete walls of the ADX Florence prison in Colorado rose from the desert like a fortress. Designed to contain the most dangerous inmates in America, it was a place where silence itself felt like punishment. Each prisoner lived alone, sealed within a cell measuring 7 by 12 feet. For Ted Kaczynski, it was a strange echo of the life he had once chosen in Montana, except now, he had no freedom to step outside. His cell contained a narrow bed, a metal sink, a toilet, and a small desk bolted to the wall. Through a slit of reinforced glass, he could see nothing but a patch of sky. Each day, he was allowed 1 hour outside, alone, in a concrete enclosure referred to by inmates as the dog run. Even there, the sky was visible only through a wire mesh ceiling. In the years following his sentencing, Ted settled into a routine with the same discipline he had once applied to his life in the forest. He woke early, exercised in his cell, read, and wrote. The prison library became his lifeline. He consumed books on philosophy, history, ecology, and mathematics, his old passions resurfacing amid the stillness of confinement. What surprised the world was how quickly he began to attract attention again. Journalists, scholars, and even admirers wrote to him, eager to understand the mind behind the manifesto. Some saw him as a visionary who had predicted the dangers of unchecked technology. Others viewed him as a deluded murderer. But Ted didn't seek sympathy or approval. In his letters, he spoke not of regret, but of ideas. He remained convinced that industrial civilization was eroding human freedom. He began corresponding with academics who studied radicalism, philosophy, and environmentalism. Each letter was written in his neat, precise handwriting. He analyzed social trends, dissected political ideologies, and offered critiques of modern technology. To those who engaged with him, it was clear that the same intellect that once solved advanced mathematical problems was still at work, sharp, disciplined, and detached. Inside ADX Florence, he was housed alongside notorious figures, terrorists, cartel leaders, and killers. Yet Ted rarely interacted with anyone. He was polite when addressed by guards but otherwise kept to himself. He lived, once again, in silence. Prison records showed he received dozens of letters each week. Many came from people curious about his life in Montana. Others asked for advice or philosophical insight. Some sent manifestos of their own, seeking validation. Ted replied to very few. When he did, his responses were short and analytical, almost professorial. Outside, the myth of the Unabomber grew. Books were written about him, documentaries aired, and university courses discussed his writings. His manifesto, once a document of terror, was now examined as a philosophical text, not endorsed, but dissected. In a strange way, Ted's ideas had survived, even as his freedom had not. He learned that his cabin, the tiny wooden structure that had once been his sanctuary, had been transported to a museum in Washington, D.C. It was displayed as part of an exhibit on domestic terrorism, surrounded by glass and security guards. Visitors would stand before it, peering inside to glimpse the life of the man who had brought the nation's mail system to its knees. When Ted heard about the exhibit, he reportedly smiled faintly. He found it ironic that the very society he despised now treated his isolation as a curiosity. The cabin that had symbolized his rejection of modern life was now preserved by that same modernity. In 1999, he began corresponding with a small circle of thinkers who were critical of industrial civilization. Though he had no access to the internet, word of his ideas spread online. Forums and websites began quoting his work, debating whether he had been a prophet or a monster. He became an unlikely cultural figure, a symbol of the tension between progress and destruction. Within the prison walls, Ted remained consistent. He never apologized for his crimes. When asked about remorse in an interview, he responded in writing, "I regret the suffering caused to individuals, but I do not regret the fight against the system that enslaves mankind." Those words deepened the divide in public opinion. To some, they confirmed his unrepentant nature. To others, they reinforced the notion that he had always been a man trapped between genius and delusion. His family, especially his brother David, struggled with the aftermath. David had been the one to identify him, the one who made the call that ended the violence. But it also ended the bond between them. Ted refused to speak with him after the arrest. Letters from David went unanswered for years. It wasn't until the early 2000s that a fragile line of communication opened between them again. Brief notes, distant and formal. Meanwhile, Ted's correspondence with journalists grew increasingly selective. He refused interviews that focused on his personal life. Instead, he insisted that anyone who wanted to speak with him address the ideas, not the man. He believed his story had been turned into spectacle, and he wanted to redirect attention back to his critique of technology. By 2005, Ted's health had begun to decline. Years of isolation and limited movement took a toll. He developed chronic pain and occasional dizziness but refused most medical treatment. When prison doctors offered him medication, he replied that his discomfort was a natural part of the human condition. Despite the physical decay, his mind remained sharp. He continued writing essays and notes that would later be published by independent presses. In these writings, he reflected on everything from human psychology to environmental collapse. He dismissed both capitalism and socialism as extensions of the same technological system he despised. In the outside world, his image evolved further. Films, books, and even art installations drew from his story. The 2017 television series Manhunt, Unabomber dramatized the FBI's pursuit of him, introducing a new generation to his life. Ted was aware of the show, fellow inmates mentioned it to him, but he refused to watch. He didn't care about the dramatization. To him, it was just another product of the culture he had rejected. Still, the renewed attention brought more letters, more discussions, more fascination. Decades after his capture, he remained a subject of study and obsession. Some saw him as the embodiment of what happens when intellect is consumed by ideology. Others saw him as a tragic warning, a man who sought freedom but found only a cage. Ted himself never viewed his confinement as defeat. He once wrote, "Freedom is not a matter of geography. It is a matter of spirit." For him, the cell was merely another setting, another environment to endure. By the 2010s, his correspondence with academics continued, and some of his essays were archived at universities. He was now a figure who existed in two worlds, a condemned criminal and a subject of intellectual inquiry. Time inside the Supermax moved slowly, measured in the shifting light through a narrow window. Ted aged quietly, his beard turning gray, his posture stooping slightly. But the discipline of his routine never faltered. Every day, he wrote. Every day, he read. Every day, he thought about the civilization he had long ago declared war upon. Outside those walls, technology advanced at an astonishing pace. Smartphones, social media, artificial intelligence. The world had become more connected, more automated, more dependent on machines than ever before. In a way, it was exactly the future Ted had warned about. But he could only observe from afar, his words echoing through the decades like a warning no one truly wanted to heed. And so, behind concrete walls and layers of steel, Ted Kaczynski continued to exist as both man and myth. The hermit philosopher, the mathematician turned murderer, the thinker who tried to stop the future and became a part of it. In the sterile silence of his cell, he wrote one final note in his journal. "They will say I am gone. But the machine goes on. And so does the resistance, wherever there is breath." By the 2020s, Ted Kaczynski had become a ghost in the collective American memory. A man whose name was once spoken with fear, now uttered with curiosity and uneasy fascination. The Unabomber. The recluse who waged war on modernity from a cabin in Montana. The brilliant mathematician turned domestic terrorist. His body aged, but his legend endured. Inside the Supermax prison in Florence, Colorado, time had slowed to a crawl. Ted's world was measured by the echo of footsteps in concrete corridors and the mechanical buzz of doors locking behind him. He was now in his late 70s, frail but still sharp. His beard had turned completely white, his face hollowed by age and illness. Yet, even as his health declined, he continued to write. The act of putting pen to paper was the last remnant of control in a life stripped of it. Every morning, guards would see the same routine. Ted would wake before dawn, straighten the sheets of his narrow bed, and sit at his desk. He'd write for hours, letters, reflections, and notes about philosophy, history, and ecology. He remained defiant, still committed to the ideas that had shaped his life's course. To him, industrial civilization was not just flawed, it was doomed. His mind never left that theme, even as his body weakened. In 2021, Ted began experiencing severe abdominal pain. Medical tests confirmed what he had quietly suspected for months: advanced cancer. The diagnosis was grim, but Ted's reaction was detached. He refused to express fear or sadness. When doctors discussed treatment options, he listened politely and then declined. "I've lived enough years," he said simply. He was transferred from ADX Florence to the Federal Medical Center in Butner, North Carolina, a facility that cared for inmates with serious health conditions. The move marked the first time in decades that Ted had left the walls of the Supermax. To the outside world, he was still the Unabomber. To the prison staff, he was just another aging inmate nearing the end of his life. In Butner, the environment was quieter, more humane. He had a slightly larger cell, a few more interactions with other inmates, and limited time outdoors under supervision. But his habits remained the same. He read, wrote, and observed. The passage of time did little to soften his views. In letters sent during his final years, he continued to argue that humanity was enslaved by its own inventions. He warned of environmental collapse, artificial intelligence, and the erosion of privacy, the same themes that had defined his manifesto decades earlier. Outside prison walls, the fascination with Ted Kaczynski persisted. Researchers and journalists continued to write about him. Documentaries revisited his story, not only as a tale of crime but as a psychological study of isolation and obsession. Universities taught courses that analyzed his writings alongside other radical thinkers. Yet for all the analysis, the man himself remained unknowable. Even those who corresponded with him found him reserved, almost clinical in tone. His letters were precise, unemotional, and philosophical. He offered no nostalgia, no remorse. When asked about the people harmed by his actions, he replied only that the victims were casualties in a war that they did not understand. It was this mixture of intellect and cold detachment that continued to haunt those who studied him. How could a man capable of such clear reasoning also commit acts of cruelty so deliberate and distant? There were no easy answers, and Ted offered none. In 2022, as his illness progressed, he stopped responding to letters. His handwriting, once firm and even, grew shaky. Guards noticed he was eating less, speaking little. But he never complained. He was still, in his own way, the man from the woods, stoic, withdrawn, self-contained. When he was no longer able to write, he spent his days reading. The books varied: philosophy, mathematics, classical literature, environmental studies. A guard once noticed that Ted had marked several pages in a worn copy of Thoreau's Walden. He had underlined a passage that read, "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation." It was, perhaps, the only sentiment he ever agreed with completely. As the world outside continued to move forward, faster, more connected, more digital, Ted's relevance took on a strange new form. On the internet, people debated his legacy, quoting lines from his manifesto as warnings about technology's unchecked growth. Some treated his ideas as prophecy, others condemned them as madness. But the debate itself was proof of something he had always understood. Once an idea is released into the world, it cannot be contained. On June 10, 2023, in the early morning hours, a guard making his rounds found Ted unresponsive in his cell at the medical center. The official report stated he had been suffering from late-stage cancer. He was 81 years old. Whether his death was the result of illness or his own choice was never publicly clarified, and perhaps it didn't matter. For a man who had spent his life seeking control, his final moment arrived quietly, without spectacle. The news spread quickly. Unabomber Ted Kaczynski dead at 81. Read the headlines. For many, it was the end of a dark chapter in American history. For others, it was the closing of a story that had become as much legend as fact. David Kaczynski, his younger brother, received the news with quiet sorrow. He had lived for decades carrying the burden of turning Ted in, a decision that had saved lives but forever fractured his family. In interviews, he often said he still loved his brother but could never understand him. When asked about Ted's death, David said simply, "I hope he's at peace now." He was never at peace in life. Ted's body was cremated, his remains unclaimed by family. No funeral, no ceremony. Just ashes, and a name that would live on in history. But the story did not end there. His writings, preserved through decades of correspondence, continued to circulate among scholars and archivists. His manifesto remained one of the most widely studied documents on the intersection of technology, freedom, and violence. It was cited in dissertations, quoted in essays, debated in classrooms. He had wanted his ideas to outlive him, and they did. Years after his death, the image of his cabin, preserved in museums and documentaries, still drew visitors. Some came out of morbid curiosity, Others came to see the simplicity of the life he had built, the place where intellect had turned into isolation, and idealism into extremism. There, behind glass, stood the small wooden table where he wrote his letters, the stove where he cooked his meals, the window that framed the endless Montana wilderness. It was a haunting sight, a reminder that the man who had once lived there had tried to bring down an entire system, and instead became consumed by his own war against it. Ted Kaczynski's legacy is one of contradiction. He was a man who loved nature but destroyed lives. A genius who rejected progress yet used the tools of modernity to fight it. A philosopher who became a criminal. He warned of the alienation and control that technology would bring, and in doing so, alienated himself completely from humanity. His story endures not because people admire him, but because they recognize the uncomfortable truths buried within it, the loneliness of intelligence, the fear of a changing world, the desperate need to find meaning in resistance, and perhaps, somewhere in that tension between brilliance and madness, between wilderness and prison, Ted Kaczynski found the only kind of freedom he ever truly believed in, the freedom to remain defiant, even to the end. His final written words, found among his belongings after his death, were brief. "The world will continue to build its machines. But in the silence of the forests, I found everything I needed to know." It was not an apology. It was not a confession. It was, like everything he ever wrote, a statement of belief, unyielding, solitary, and final.